welcome to Global Optimum, the podcast dedicated to making you a more effective altruist. I am Daniel Gambacorta. We're going to start off today with a groaner. What do you call the family member who argues that the universe must be big because big universes have more observers like us, so the very fact that we exist means we are more likely to be in the kind of universe that has lots of observers? You call her anthropic. This episode will feature 2 segments: Apply Psychology, in which I will conclude my discussion of the psychology of social status, and Check This Rec, in which I will provide you with a recommendation of a book, article, podcast that perhaps you are not familiar with. Let's get into it. In this episode, the social status trilogy shall conclude. If you haven't already listened to parts 1 and 2, I recommend you do so before listening to this episode. Some of what I talk about won't make sense if you haven't listened to the previous episodes. In this episode, I'll talk about status and hypocrisy, why vying for status is often a bad look, what is self-esteem and how does it work, what is the hormonal basis of status, and how understanding status can help us understand politics. By the end of this episode, you will be able to see the matrix. The social world will be but digital rain, a code that only you and few others can decipher. You'll be able to do things you once thought were impossible. I am only slightly overpromising. First up, status and hypocrisy. You generally aren't allowed to do things for the sake of status, even though it's obvious that status is the reason why we do much of what we do. You have to pretend otherwise. One time I was listening to a podcast with Jimmy Pardo, if you've heard of him, and he was asked why he wanted to become a comedian. He said he wanted to be famous. It was striking to me because you so rarely hear people say that they did things to be famous, even though obviously part of the motivation for getting into show business is to get famous. It is uncouth and base and gauche to do things for fame. Likewise, if you ask a doctor why they became a doctor, at least in a public setting, they aren't supposed to say because they wanted wealth and prestige. Doctors are supposed to say they got into it to help people. And I'm not trying to be Robin Hanson here. I definitely acknowledge that doctors want to help people, and that's part of what motivated their career choice. But I also take it as obvious that status and money play a role in many people's decision to become a doctor. Yet, that cannot be said in polite company. You can't say you want power and deference. Here's another puzzle. We want to be able to evaluate others as potential friends, mates, colleagues, etc. And others want to share information with us that would help us evaluate them. However, in most contexts, flattering information can't be shared in a straightforward way. If you share flattering info about yourself in such a way that it is clear that your intention was to do so, you are bragging. Bragging is generally a no-no. It is bad to be a braggart. Even though you have information you want to share, others want info about you, you can't just say it. You want to impress, others want to evaluate, but you often can't just say what's impressive about you unless you're in a job interview, which I'll get to later. Generally, bragging is a bad look. However, people do manage to brag all the time by using the technique known as humble bragging. Humble bragging is bragging, but you make it seem like it is not your intention to brag. You couch your brag within some other information and make it appear as if transmitting the other information was your true intention. The impressive information just came along for the ride. Humble brags often take the form of a complaint. For example, complaining about how busy you are as a way of signaling productivity, or complaining about being hit on as a way of signaling how attractive people find you. No, I'm not saying that all complaints function as brags, but some do. The late comedian Harris Whittles compiled humble brag tweets from celebrities, which he later turned into a book titled Humble Brag, The Art of False Modesty. Here's a tweet from the costume designer Somer Terry. Quote, "Why does the Mercedes dealership always have fresh baked hot cookies? Don't they understand how mean that is?" End quote. One may suspect that the main function of this tweet is to tell other people that Terry owns or is purchasing a Mercedes-Benz, and the bit about cookies is just window dressing. A lot of social media use is humble bragging. The same basic principle can be applied to posting pictures on social media. You make it seem like you posted a picture for reason X, and that picture just so happens to show off that you are attractive or wealthy or a world traveler, etc. Anyway, why do people humble brag instead of bragging? Isn't bragging simpler and easier to interpret? Part of the explanation is humble bragging offers plausible deniability. You can claim implicitly that your intention was not to brag. But that doesn't answer the deeper question. Why is bragging bad to begin with? Here's another puzzle. A man and woman go on a date. The man would like to signal his wealth. The woman would like to know how wealthy the man is. One way to accomplish this would be for the man to take the woman to an ATM and let her see his balance. That would be an honest signal of wealth. However, doing so would be tacky as the dickens. The man could instead buy really expensive things like a fancy car, let the woman see the car, and allow her to infer that if he was willing to buy such an expensive car, he must be wealthy. So the man can't just honestly signal his wealth, but he can show off expensive things he owns. Buying uselessly expensive stuff seems rather more wasteful and indeed unnecessarily circuitous. Why can't the guy just show the girl a bank statement? At the very least, why would he look bad for showing the girl his bank statement? All right, we have some puzzles. Let's talk solutions. I don't think all of the puzzles I've laid out have the same solution. There are a number of different explanations that apply to varying degrees to each of our puzzles. I am trying to explain why it's bad to transparently vie for status. Here are some explanations numbered for the sake of structure. Number 1, those who are already high status don't want to be replaced, so they aren't happy about seeing lower status people climbing the ladder. People don't want their authority challenged, and when you openly vie for status, you are challenging that authority. Number 2, as I discussed in part 1, status serves a group function. Challenges to the existing hierarchy disturb the harmony of the group and cause the group to perform worse. In other species and in humans, under some circumstances, challenging the existing hierarchy predictably leads to violence. When you openly strive for status, you might be hurting your group merely by causing disorder. Number 3, dominators can make all others worse off. Someone who is dominant has status by virtue of being able to impose costs on others. Dominators take their status by force. Across species, dominant males may monopolize mating and take more than their fair share of food and territory. If the dominant male can't be dethroned, then everyone else has to just suck it up and hope that in time the dominant male will weaken or die. In human history, dominant individuals have probably been a significant problem for groups, and we humans have evolved intuitions that compel us to prevent anyone from dominating. Hunter-gatherer societies are fairly egalitarian, if we ignore gender relations for a moment, and there are norms against showing off. Budding tyrants may be ridiculed, exiled, or executed. One can also come off as dominating by being too competent or too generous. Here's a quote from the book The Goodness Paradox by the anthropologist Richard Wrangham, in which he recounts the story of a fellow anthropologist giving too nice a gift to a hunter-gatherer tribe. Quote, "The anthropologist Richard Lee described his own experience of being humbled. A young man at the time, he wanted to give a big Christmas present to the band of Juhuansi hunter-gatherers that he was studying, so he surprised them by buying a magnificent ox. The Juhuansi had no money and had to hunt for days to get a large animal. Their response to the splendid gift of meat shocked Lee. The men were insulting. They said the ox had no meat on it. They called it a bag of bones. They said the ox was so thin they would have to eat the horns." Eventually, an elder called Tommaso explained what was going on. The gift had made Lee look arrogant. "When a young man kills much meat," says Tommaso, "he comes to think of himself as a chief or big man, and he thinks of the rest of us as his servants or inferiors. We can't accept this. We refuse one who boasts, for someday his pride will make him kill somebody. So we always speak of his meat as worthless. That way we cool his heart and make him gentle." End quote. In modern society, we likewise don't take kindly to those who seem to be positioning themselves as dominators. We don't like blatant status grabs. When we see attempts at domination, this triggers the status slap down. If someone is getting too big for their britches, we feel compelled to knock them down a peg. We want to slap down potential dominators through ridicule, gossip, or other measures that could lower their status. We do want to give people status, but we want it to be prestige rather than dominance. We want to freely give status as part of an exchange rather than have deference demanded from us. Imagine an actor receives the Oscar for Best Actor. The typical acceptance speech deflects status. Award winners are supposed to credit others for their achievement. What if an award winner said something like, "I am the best actor. I deserve this award. I am better than all the other actors"? Even if this was true, and given that they won the Oscar, there is some evidence to that effect, speaking the truth would be a bad look. We don't want deference demanded of us. We want to give it freely. We don't want people to be giving off signs that they are going to lord their status over us. We want to have some control over those with status. All that being said, dominance is still a feasible strategy. There are plenty of people who have more of a dominating style. People like Donald Trump and Kanye West are playing a dominance strategy. Dominance garners lots of haters, but it can still work as a way of getting attention and deference. Number 4, I throw around the word signaling on this podcast. By signaling, I just mean something like transmitting information. We may also speak of countersignaling. Countersignaling occurs when individuals with the highest level of a given property invest less into signaling that property than individuals with a median level of that property. In other words, cool people don't go around talking about how cool they are. It is often cooler to not signal than to signal if your audience already has some information about your coolness. A student who wants to look smart may raise their hand when the teacher asks a hard question, but won't raise their hand when the teacher asks an easy question. Even though this student knows the answer to the easy question, they want to distinguish themselves from the other students who can only answer easy questions. When we try to understand why vying for status is a bad look, part of the explanation is that vying is signaling, and sometimes signaling looks worse than counter-signaling. If someone is bragging, they may look arrogant, or they may look lame and pathetic. In this latter case, bragging makes it look like you don't think you are worthy of your audience, so you have to prove yourself. Bragging can look like you're trying to justify why it's worth associating with you. And the thing is, if you were a cool person worth associating with, the bragging wouldn't be necessary. Your audience would already have some information that caused them to evaluate you as high status. A cool person would counter-signal by not bragging. So if you are bragging, it means you must not be a cool person. The case of the man who brings his date to an ATM is a similar kind of case. It's try hard. It's trying too hard to signal your attractiveness. Attractive people counter-signal. They count on there being other evidence of their attractiveness, which thereby makes blatantly effortful signaling unnecessary. If you try too hard, you aren't counter-signaling, which is what the attractive people do. Part of attractiveness is acting like you aren't trying hard to seem attractive, because attractive people don't try hard to seem attractive. To reiterate what I said earlier, it's not like people don't brag or show off their wealth or what have you. They just do it in ways that maintains plausible deniability. When you humble brag, you can implicitly claim that you weren't trying to brag, and therefore you can pretend that you're not trying hard to impress. When you just so happen to own expensive things, you can implicitly claim that you like these expensive things for reasons other than their signaling value. You just like fancy cars or fancy watches or whatever, so you can conspicuously consume, and it's not try hard. All right, those are the 4 reasons why vying for status is a bad look. We all vie for status, of course, but we do it in a way that makes it look like we weren't trying to vie for status. We are all hypocrites. To wrap up this section, I'll mention the exception that proves the rule, which is the job interview. At a job interview, it is acceptable to brag. One thing I would say is you can still go too far with bragging at a job interview. The second thing I would say is during a job interview, the interviewee is firmly lower status, so there isn't any actual status jockeying that goes on. And the third thing I would say is there's common knowledge that the interviewee wants the job. In the social world, it's not cool to seem like you really need new friends or that you're desperate to find love. In social life, people generally try to come off like they can take it or leave it, that they already have the relationships they want, because cool people do already have the relationships they want. In contrast, when you go on a job interview, you've shown your hand. You can't act like you are too cool for the job. Interviews are try hard by their very nature. Also, there's common knowledge that the interviewer doesn't have that much time to evaluate candidates, is working with limited information, and has to make a high-stakes yes-no decision. As opposed to in the social world, where you often have more time to evaluate people, and you don't have to decide whether to marry them in the first hour. You can rather take small steps towards increasing commitment over time. So in a job interview, a communication style that cuts to the chase is necessary. Next up, I shall speak of self-esteem. Self-esteem is your sense of self-worth, how you evaluate yourself, how positively or negatively you feel about yourself. Self-esteem is a fuzzy concept, though probably not completely useless. I'll give 5 items from a commonly used self-esteem scale to give an idea of what psychologists are measuring when they measure self-esteem. Some of these statements exemplify high self-esteem, while others exemplify low self-esteem. For each of these, think about whether you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with them. 1. On the whole, I am satisfied with myself. 2. I feel I do not have much to be proud of. 3. I certainly feel useless at times. 4. I wish I could have more respect for myself. 5. I take a positive attitude toward myself. Self-esteem correlates with good stuff. Having high self-esteem is associated with happiness, life satisfaction, strong relationships, and better achievement in school. Low self-esteem is associated with depression and drug abuse. Based on these correlations, it was thought that self-esteem causes good stuff. Therefore, we should boost people's self-esteem so they get better outcomes. However, it seems like self-esteem is mostly a consequence of the things that happen to people rather than the cause. Good outcomes cause high self-esteem rather than the other way around. The best way to conceptualize self-esteem is as a kind of meter. It's a meter that tracks how you are doing socially, a sociometer, if you will. The sociometer tracks how well accepted you are, your status, and your relational value. Relational value is the emotional value you get from your relationship with a person, distinct from the value you get from what the person can do for you. Your children have high relational value mostly because you love them, not because they will help you make money or gain status or whatnot. Some of the value we get from family, friendships, and romantic relationships is this relational value, the value we get from the relationship itself. I mentioned before that we were in fuzzy territory, and I acknowledge this is fuzzy, but still, I think this is a pretty good model. If you feel accepted by your tribe, you have high status, and you have high relational value, your sociometer will output high self-esteem. If you don't feel accepted, are low status, and have low relational value, your sociometer will output low self-esteem. We can also make some noises about how, from an evolutionary perspective, it seems rather important to keep track of our social standing. High self-esteem feels better than low self-esteem, so we are emotionally motivated to do things like gain status and get people to like us. And plausibly, high status and being well-liked are associated with higher fitness. High self-esteem seems like a good thing to have. So, how does one acquire high self-esteem? Alas, I don't think there are any easy answers. One obvious thing to check is to make sure your perceptions of others' perceptions of you are not unrealistically negative. If you think people don't like you when they actually do like you, that ain't good for self-esteem. Cognitive behavioral therapy seems like the kind of thing that helps some people address unrealistically negative thoughts, though I'm not a clinical psychologist and this isn't my area of expertise, so I make no strong recommendation. Other than that, I think you just have to build self-esteem the hard way. Actually gain status and get people to like you, which is what people try to do anyway. So yeah. Next, I'll talk about hormones and status. I'm going to focus on testosterone because it's been studied a fair bit, and I'll mostly focus on men. The studies I'll discuss are studies of men, and the theories I'll discuss mostly pertain to men. There's just less known about hormones and female status. In men, testosterone is associated with sex drive, mate seeking, and status. Winning contests increases testosterone, whereas losing contests decreases testosterone. This has been demonstrated in wrestling, tennis, chess, timed reaction tests, and games of chance. Testosterone goes up in winners and down in losers. There is a similar effect when the team or coalition you associate with wins or loses. In the 1994 World Cup, Brazil defeated Italy. Following the match, testosterone increased in Brazilian fans and testosterone decreased in Italian fans. In the 2008 U.S. presidential election, Obama defeated John McCain. In the hours following the announcement of the election results, supporters of Obama saw an increase in testosterone and supporters of McCain saw a decrease in testosterone. I don't have faith that all of these findings would replicate, but I think there's enough evidence that I'm convinced there's some connection between testosterone and contest outcomes. Last episode, I talked about different psychological modes related to status seeking and mate seeking. It's plausible that testosterone plays a causal role in determining what psychological mode men are in. According to this perspective, testosterone affects whether men are focused on gaining status and finding mates versus mate retention and childcare. Consistent with this view, men's testosterone increases when they interact with women, perhaps even more so when they interact with attractive, flirty women. Men's testosterone goes down after they fall in love. This may cause men to focus less on finding new mates and to focus more on maintaining the mate they have. Men's testosterone also decreases after having children. This plausibly functions to motivate men to pay less attention to mating and to pay more attention to parental care. Indeed, investing more effort in parental care is correlated with lower testosterone. So if we're trying to look under the hood and figure out how status works, testosterone is an important part of the story, for men at least. We should be careful to not encapsulate the mystery as a substance. It would be too simple to conceptualize testosterone as the status molecule. It's not literally the case that high testosterone equals high status psychology. In reality, this is all a complicated mess. Cortisol, which is a hormone associated with stress, also seems to play an important role in the psychology of status, and other hormones are implicated as well, but I'm convinced that testosterone is important. Moving on, I will next talk about how to take on high status behaviors. Say you are in a situation where you sure would like to come off as high status. Wouldn't it be nice if you can just turn it on? We've all been in situations where we were comfortable, confident, assertive, and other situations where we've been shy, fearful, and awkward. Can we make ourselves confident? Can we shift into a high status mode? Alas, not directly. Fear exists for a reason. You can't just decide to stop feeling afraid. Likewise, you can't just decide to act high status. In part 1 of this series, I talked about the behaviors associated with high and low status. You can't just study the behaviors of high status people and consciously implement all of them simultaneously. Social interaction is way too complicated. The behaviors associated with status are largely governed by a System 1 process. As with other System 1 processes, if you add in too much System 2, you screw things up. If you consciously go out of your way to, for example, give lots of eye contact and maintain an expanded body posture and speak with a deep tone of voice, you may end up looking strange. This stuff can't be consciously orchestrated, at least not much. Here's my basic model of status behavior. You get cues from the environment as to what your status is. This causes various physiological changes, like increasing or decreasing testosterone. These physiological changes cause you to behave in high or low status ways. So there's 2 ways to influence your status psychology. Control the cues you are getting from your environment and change your physiology. As I discussed in part 1, there are 2 types of status, prestige and dominance. One way to act high status is to get cues from your environment that you are prestigious. You give people something that they want, like leadership, art, affiliation, or beauty, and in return, they give you praise, respect, and deference. The cues you receive from others will put you into a particular behavioral mode. It is very easy to be high status after doing an impressive thing for an audience and having the audience express their appreciation. In that scenario, you have prestige, and the praise from the audience puts you into a high status mode. By the same token, if you try to do an impressive thing in front of an audience and you perform poorly, and the audience lets you know you've performed poorly, that will put you into more of a low status mode. When you fail publicly, you've signaled negative traits about yourself, your social value goes down, and your sociometer goes down. So one way to take on high status behaviors is to have prestige. The second type of status is dominance. There's a dark side to dominance. Some of the appeal of bullying and tyranny comes from getting dominance status. Dominating others can make you feel and act high status. A lot of the dumb things that young men do are motivated by the desire for dominance. There is a way to hack dominant status, and it doesn't rely on the dark side of the force per se. A way to get dominant status is to break social norms in the way that high status people are allowed to and not get slapped down for it. If you can break social norms and get away with it, your brain gets signals from the environment that you are not in danger, that if you act high status, nothing bad will happen to you, no one will challenge you. This changes your physiology and puts you into a high status mode. So what kind of social norms am I talking about here? It depends on the context you are in, and importantly, I am saying that stretching social norms in the way that high status people are allowed to is what can put you into a high status mode. I am not saying to act like you are mentally ill or unable to read social cues. I mean pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable a bit. For example, singing, yelling, or dancing at times when it isn't 100% appropriate. Again, I don't mean doing these things at a funeral. I mean singing with a group of friends as you walk down a busy street, or yelling at a crowded party. These are examples of bending social rules. You are infringing on other people a bit, but not in a way that signals you are on drugs. Other examples would be talking to people you don't know, speaking a bit too loud, talking a bit too much, speaking without much of a filter, being willing to voice unpopular opinions and be disagreeable. If you do this and you don't get slapped down, your brain gets evidence that you have status in the environment. If you do get slapped down, if you do get called out or insulted or challenged, then this won't work. But in modern society, the vast majority of people won't be willing to call someone out for stretching social norms. Try this technique at your own risk. It does work. Techniques like these are popular in particular circles that need not be named. Next up, I'll talk about intervening on your physiology. In general, being healthy is conducive to behaving high status, sleeping enough, exercising, and avoiding excessive stress. Nothing too insightful to say here. The only hack that I think can be useful is boosting physiological arousal if you are feeling low. Being high status requires more energy. It requires a higher level of alertness. So if you are feeling low on energy, just getting your heart rate up by moving around is helpful for acting high status. We have this concept of getting pumped. Before a physical performance, someone might listen to music and move around to get pumped up. That's what I'm getting at here. Of course, you don't always want to be pumped up, but if you are low on pump, I think pumping is not useless. The only other thing I'll mention is power posing does not work. A paper came out in 2010 suggesting that if you adopt a body posture associated with power for a few minutes, it can increase testosterone. Also, maintaining a high power pose compared to a low power pose is associated with a greater willingness to take risks and greater feelings of power. If you want to see what these poses look like, you can Google power posing. Based on the findings of this paper, Amy Cuddy, who is one of the authors, gave a TED Talk in which she suggested that right before doing a job interview, you should do a few minutes of power posing. She suggests going into the bathroom and adopting a high power pose because you will feel and behave more powerfully afterward. Well, as it goes in psychology, the findings of the original paper failed to replicate. I do not recommend power posing to become more powerful. It seems like Cuddy is still holding out on the idea that power posing may make people feel more powerful, even if it doesn't really do anything else. I suspect that the data that supports this claim is the result of a demand characteristic that if you have someone stand like Wonder Woman for a minute and then ask them to rate how powerful they feel, they say they feel powerful because they think they're supposed to say they feel powerful. But hey, this is the kind of thing that's easy to test yourself. Power pose for 2 minutes and see how you feel. If it works, then you have a technique for feeling powerful whenever you want. I don't think it'll work, but it's pretty cheap to try out. Next up, I'll go into the final topic of this episode, status and politics. Lots of political issues clearly have a status element to them. Some hot button issues are mostly about which groups we think should go up or down in status. These issues are phrased as policies, but they are mostly about who gets respect and who you are allowed to make fun of. Here are some examples given by the economist Tyler Cowen in a 2008 blog post. This is going to be a long quote, but I think it's worth it. Here we go. Quote. Take the so-called right wing. I believe that some people on the right do not like those they perceive as whiners. They do not want these whiners to rise in relative status. That means they must argue against the whining, and also they must argue against the presuppositions behind the whining. If the whiners say that times are bad, the rebuttal is that times are pretty good or times will become better again. But if the whiners want to increase government benefits, we hear about the need to tighten our belts, and all the talk about good times is at least temporarily muted. Take the so-called left wing. Some of these people favor a kind of meritocracy. They feel it's unfair that money so determines access in a capitalist society, and they do not want the moneyed class to rise in relative status, certainly not above the status of the smart people and the virtuous people. It is important to fight for the principle that the desires of this moneyed class have a relatively low priority in the social ranking. Egalitarianism is the rhetoric of the day, and readjusting the status of other Americans to the status of this moneyed class often receives more attention than elevating the very poorest of the world to a higher absolute level. So when happiness research indicates that money brings more happiness only up to a point, this is a popular result. That perspective lowers the status of this moneyed class by showing they really aren't that happy. When happiness research indicates that conservatives are relatively happy, however, or that many redistributions don't make the beneficiaries much happier, suddenly happiness research isn't talked up so much. Some on the right wing will stress individual responsibility as a value when it lowers the status of the whiners. Some on the left wing will stress individual responsibility when it's time to punish corporate wrongdoers and thus lower their status. Not everyone applies this value consistently. Given this difference in rhetoric, the right wing will be identified with the moneyed class, even when the left often has more money, and the left wing will be identified as the whiners, even though the right at times whines as much or more. You might say that both sides are moneyed, high human capital whiners on the whole. And if you compare them to Burmese rice farmers, the two sides seem somewhat alike. End quote. Politics has hidden layers to it. Status is one of those hidden layers. As a wise man once said, politics is not about policy, which of course is overstated, but if you could only utter one sentence to help someone understand politics, it's not a bad choice. Perhaps our love of democracy is also motivated by status considerations. In our democracies, we are led, we are coerced, but we elect our leaders. It is a prestige relationship. Our leaders have power, but it's because we give them power, and we only give it to them if we get what we want in return. We don't like monarchs. Monarchs are dominators. We are low status when ruled by a monarch, so we opt for the political system that at least lets us feel higher status. This is obviously not the whole story. There's plenty of nice things about democracy that make it appealing, but maybe status is part of the reason why people like democracy. All right, that is it for this segment. The trilogy has come to an end. By this time, I expect you can dodge bullets and fly and do the other things that Neo can do. At the very least, you are hopefully slightly better at saving the world. Neo saved the world, and all he had was magical matrix powers. We don't need magical matrix powers. We have the power of science. And as we all know, science beats matrix powers. Though, if you have matrix powers and you want to share them, do let me know. In this segment, I recommend some bit of media that you are perhaps unfamiliar with. This episode's rec is a podcast. The title of the podcast is Future Strategist. It is hosted by the economist James Miller. The podcast is a mixture of interviews and solo episodes. Miller covers topics such as rationality, AI, existential risk, history, and transhumanism. Interview guests include Brian Kaplan, Robin Hanson, Razib Khan, and Roman Yampolsky. If you want to know how to think strategically about the future, and you have a sec, check this rec. That's it for this episode. The sources I've referred to throughout the episode, including this week's rec, can be found in the show notes. This podcast is an effective altruist project. If you aren't familiar with effective altruism and you would like to learn more, I would recommend visiting effectivealtruism.org. Now, go forth and make history.